You know, I think if we were honest, all of us would acknowledge that at some time or other, we've had challenges in our life that we couldn't handle, that we didn't have an answer to. We had some mountain we couldn't climb, some problem we couldn't overcome, some issue that was just too big for us. And maybe right now that's what you're facing. Maybe you've got bills coming in that you can't pay. Maybe you've got some family relationship issue that you just can't solve, you can't fix up. You know, I know what that's like. It's challenging sometimes. We try and say something to fix the problem, and it just keeps getting worse and worse. Maybe you need a miracle in your life, maybe with accommodation or employment. You need a miracle in some area of your life. Maybe you just feel today a bit burnt out by life or jaded by some past experience, maybe even a bad experience in church, and you haven't been able to get over that. You know, sometimes it's easier to, and this is very often, it's human nature, it's easier to check out when we have those things rather than to sign up or sign on with faith and expectancy in God. And, you know, maybe serving God in some capacity, but you feel burnt out. I'll tell you, I've been burnt out myself a few times. But I say it carefully today because I know it's easy that we can major on those things too much. But, you know, I've been through some times like that myself. And I've had to rise up above that and say, God, one thing I know for sure, people can fail. You know, I fail. We all do dumb things at times. But I know one thing for sure, God, you are good. And that's why we keep singing those songs. God, you are so good. I think we need to keep declaring that. I tell you, I get in the car sometimes. I do a fair bit of praying when I'm in the car and driving around. And I just shout out how good God is. And I keep declaring that to myself because I need to do that. And we all should do that. He is so good. And maybe you're wondering, will I ever be able to sign up to serve God with enthusiasm and commitment again? Maybe you're not sure about that. I want to share with you this morning one of the great stories from the Old Testament where God came down and rescued some people who were in a very difficult situation that they couldn't work out themselves. And we're going to read today from the book of Judges. There's some pretty amazing stuff in the book of Judges, but I want to read to you from Judges chapter 4 today. And the book of Judges is about all these cycles of God's people where they rejected God. They turned away from God. Then all of a sudden they found themselves in a bad way, you know, facing enemies they couldn't overcome. And then they cried out to God, and he sent someone to deliver them from their struggles and deliver them and raise them up again. So we're going to read from Judges chapter 4, verse 1 to 3. If we can stick that up on the screen, that'll be great. So the people of Israel kept right on doing evil in God's sight with Ehud, however you say that, dead. That's the previous leader of Israel. God sold them off to Jabin, king of Canaan, who ruled from Hazor. Now, I want to tell you we're going to stop right there and say, this is Old Testament, guys. This is Old Covenant. Now, when you do something dumb, when you fail, when you sin before God, he's not going to sell you off. He's not going to punish you. He's not going to, because we've got to understand we're living in a different day. This is the new covenant era when Jesus paid the penalty for your sin and mine. So important we get that. But we can still learn from these Old Testament stories. In fact, the Bible says they're included for our benefit so that we can learn some things about God and about how he works. So, but we're not living in the same era as this. Okay, so the people they got into trouble. They became slaves, basically, to this guy, Jabin. And Sisera, who lived in that place, was the commander of Jabin's army. So the people of Israel cried out to God, as they always did, because Jabin or Sisera had cruelly oppressed them with his 900 iron chariots for 20 years. Okay, so they were in a bad way, but they cried out to God, and the next thing is what happened. So Deborah was a prophet, the wife of Lapidoth. She was judge over Israel at that time. Basically the leader. She was someone that God spoke through her, and she was more or less the leader of Israel at that time, of the people of God. So she sent for Barak, son of Abinoam, from Kedesh. There's a lot of names here, but we're going to just skip over some of them. The highlighted ones are because I'm going to come back to them later on. And she said to this guy, Barak, it's become clear that God, the God of Israel, commands you. Now, I kind of like this because it says, here's Deborah, the prophet of God, and she's saying, it has become clear. It's like she didn't get this handwriting in the clouds or this revelation all of a sudden. It probably took a little bit of time, but she knew there was a stirring in her heart, and she knew what God was saying. It's become clear that God, the God of Israel, commands you, go to Mount Tabor and prepare for battle. So there was a fight coming, a battle coming, that they were going to be delivered from their enemies. So take 10 companies of soldiers, about 10,000 soldiers from Naphtali and Zebulun. These are basically the tribes around where this guy Barak lived. I'll take care of getting Sisera, the leader of Jabin's army, to the Kishon River with all his chariots and troops. I'll make sure you win the battle. Okay, this is kind of cool because here's this woman, the prophet of God, and she is saying to Barak, I want you to go out and lead the army, but I'm going to make sure you win the battle. So God is speaking. God is speaking through her. And Barak said, if you go with me, I'll go. But if you don't go with me, I won't go. Big, tough Barak. Big, strong Barak. Okay, the next one says, and she said, of course I'll go with you. But understand that with an attitude like that, there'll be no glory in it for you. Because isn't that funny? Because God will use a woman's hand to take care of Sisera, the captain of the enemy army. Now, we're not going to read the rest of that story because it actually gets a bit gruesome at the end. And you can read it for yourself in Judges chapter 4. But Deborah got ready and went with Barak to Kedesh. And she said to Barak, when they lined up, they got to where they were going, and the armies were all lined up. And she said to Barak, charge this very day. God has given you victory over Sisera. Isn't God marching before you? Now, I want you to understand here. By the time they got to the battle place, Barak raised up about 10,000. He recruited about 10,000 soldiers. By the time they got there, there were 40,000. You can read this in the next chapter. It tells you more of the story. 40,000, but they were unarmed. These were unarmed people. It also tells us in the next chapter, there was not a shield or a spear on site anywhere in Israel. They were unarmed. So Deborah says to Barak, charge because God is with you. Isn't God marching before you? He has given you victory over Sisera. It's important we understand that God's way bigger than us. He's more powerful than us. He's got ways of dealing with things that we can't understand. Now, actually, in the next chapter, we're not going to read much of or a little bit of the next chapter, but it gives us a lot of detail about this battle. Actually, it looks like an unusually strong rainstorm came down, and this army of Sisera, this army they were facing, they had 900 iron chariots, and it looks like where they were in this kind of valley and on the sides of the hill, and this unbelievable rainstorm came down, and rivulets of water coming down the hill. Their chariots became useless. They were all bogged in the mud, and they all ran off somewhere, and the creek and the river was flooding, and they all got washed away. That's what it looks like what happened. But when Barak, the leader of God's people, was recruiting, it says take 10,000 soldiers, and they got to the battle, and there was 40,000 by the time they got there. It reminds me of, in the First World War in Australia, a little bit of history, military history here. When the call went out in Australia in the First World War for people to join the army, there were from about little towns all over Australia, people started marching. The first one of these was in, I think, Gilgandra, down in New South Wales. And there were about 26 soldiers left there and marched to Sydney, about 500 kilometres. And every town they went through, they would shout this cooey kind of a shout thing. And by the time they got to Sydney, their numbers had grown by 10 times. And I don't know if you're aware of this, but the same thing happened here, because a group of about 26 soldiers left Warwick in November 1915, came up through Toowoomba, then down through Gatton, Laidley to Brisbane, and they grew by about 5 times by the time they got there. This had happened all over Australia. There was this recruitment drive thing happen. It was quite remarkable. And that's exactly what happened in this case here. So these are unarmed soldiers, but they won a great victory because God was with them. Let's go to the next slide. And it says this in verse 20 of Judges 5. It says, the stars in the sky joined the fight, and from their courses they fought against Sisera. Now, I've studied this passage and a few other verses in this Judges 5. It is very clear where it says stars, it's not talking about the stars, it's talking about angelic beings. What happened is angels were there on hand. Angels were fighting for the people of God. And it's so important we get a hold of this today, because we don't need to understand too much about military strategy. What we need to understand is that if God is for you, who can be against you? The angels, it says, in the sky joined the fight. I tell you, you want to read verse 13, Judges 5:13. It's not on the slide, but it just says that then the remnant came down to meet the mighty ones, or to meet the brave ones. It's actually talking about those angelic beings that were there, ready to fight for the people of God. So God's put his angelic angels down there to fight for his people. It was incredible. And they won a great battle. In Job chapter 38, verse 7, it talks about when the creation of the world was happening. It says when the morning stars sang together when the world was being created. It's another reference to the stars being angels. They are God's heavenly beings at that time. So I want to say to you this morning, friends, that faith releases God's power to work for you. And if you're facing a situation that you don't know how to deal with, when we put our trust in God, we're going to find that his power is at work on our behalf. And something amazing can happen. Now, what I want to do this morning is to go into chapter 5, the very next chapter, because it's what it is. After the battle, Deborah and Barak, these two people that led this army, they sang this prophetic song to God. And it's an amazing, the whole chapter is a song, a prophecy about what was happening and the incredible victory of God. And we can learn some amazing things from this, about how people responded to the battle cry, the call to come to the battle. Okay, number one, there were a group of people who didn't really sign up for this battle. They were happy to stay on the sidelines, to watch from a distance. They were kind of spectators, and they didn't get involved. They were part of the people of God, but they didn't get involved. And let's read it here in Judges 5, about verse 14. It says, from Zebulun, high-ranking, these are Barak's sort of tribe or his family. From Zebulun, high-ranking leaders came down. Issachar's princes rallied to Deborah. Issachar, that's another tribe of Israel, stood fast with Barak, backing him up on the field of battle. But in Reuben, now we're going to look at some of the names of the tribes of Israel, okay? So don't be put off by that. But in Reuben's divisions, there was much second guessing. Why all those campfire discussions? And the next one goes and it says, diverted and distracted, Reuben's divisions couldn't make up their minds. So they were asking all the tribes of Israel to come down and fight the battle, but only a few actually came. So Gilead played it safe across the Jordan. And Dan, why did he go off sailing? Asher kept his distance on the seacoast, safe and secure. But Zebulun risked life and limb, defied death, as did Naphtali on the battle heights. Now, what it's saying is that there were a couple of these tribes of Israel that got right in amongst it. They were totally committed and focused. But a lot of the others stood back and they were watching to see, and they weren't sure. They were sitting around the campfire at night saying, well, what's going on here? Is this a God thing? Is this really going to work? What if we lose the battle? And who is this Barak guy? We haven't heard of him before. Who is he? Should we go down and join this battle? These are people that have been used by God previously in remarkable ways. And maybe they felt that they were perhaps on the bench in some way. We can feel sometimes like we're in reserve. We're not really doing much, but maybe God will use us at some time in the future. Or maybe they felt that they were in the stands. I don't know who watched the footy last night. The Storm and Parramatta. That was pretty awesome, hey. But it's like being in the stands, like we're watching the game. But the real action was not in your lounge room watching that. The real action was out there on the field. Okay. It just says that they were diverted and distracted, and they couldn't make up their minds. It's not hard to miss what God is doing sometimes because of the pain of the past. I've been there. A number of times, but God is saying, it's in the center of the field. That's where the action is. And I think I just want to share as a 10-year-old, God began to speak to me and say to me that one day I would serve Him in a full-time capacity, and I didn't know what that meant. All I knew was that I wanted to say yes, and I did. I was saying yes. And I want to tell you that I've been signing up to serve God ever since that time. So there's a lot of value in signing up. And when you sign up to serve God in some capacity, what happens is His power gets released in your life. Because God responds to faith. God responds to faith in our heart. Whether these people, these other tribes, whether they were willing to go or not, the point is they didn't get to the front of the battle, and basically they missed the best that God had for them. And I want to encourage you today to sign up to what God is saying to you. Whatever you need faith for, whatever you need to commit yourself to, because that's where the power of God begins to be evidenced in your life. If you're facing some challenge in your life right now, maybe it's time to really trust God. It's time, let him fight for you now. Now, I want to talk briefly about this guy called Barak, who was the commander of the army at that stage. And, Barak said to Deborah, if you go with me, I'll go. If you don't go with me, I won't go. So this is a great passage for women here. And because it shows that God is not paternalistic. Don't let anyone ever tell you that God is misogynist or God is paternalistic, or it's all about men or whatever. That's not true. That's not in the Bible. Some of the people who translated the Bible might have put that slant on things, but God is not like that, because He raised up this woman, Deborah, and she became the voice of God in that thing, and she basically led the army, and it was incredible. Now, here's Barak. So he just needed some encouragement and support, and that's okay, Deborah was a woman of great faith and great courage, great boldness, an amazing, amazing woman. And Barak did end up going out there and leading the army anyway. He just needed a bit of encouragement along the way. And I want to say to you, it's okay, because everyone needs some support at times. Everyone needs that at times. And the kingdom of God is not all about Rambo types who go out there on their own, who've got everything that it takes to do what needs to be done. It's actually a team sport. The church is a team sport. And I want to say life is a team sport. And we've got to get used to working with others and encouraging one another. Look, the New Testament is full of this. Encourage one another, provoke, it says stir up one another, or encourage one another to good works. So we've got to learn how to do that. And I've got to learn how to do that. It's probably not my natural bent. Some people are very natural at doing this. They can't wait to meet someone every day when they get out of bed in the morning. Who can I speak a positive word to? Who can I speak an encouraging word to? I don't naturally think like that myself. Maybe you do. I reckon, Warren, you're probably like that. You're one of those kind of individuals. You are. And there's probably other people here like that too. But most of the rest of us have probably got to work at it, and Matt, you're a bit like that too, I think, at the back. You're like that. You are. So I can see where you got it from, But, you know, most of us have got to work at it, and I want to encourage you to work at it because it's a good thing. You know, in the Bible, in the New Testament, there's a lot of fishing stories. Fishing stories. I saw a T-shirt the other day of a guy fishing, and he's got a little telephone, a little mobile phone. He says, "Oh, sorry I missed your call. I was on the other line." His fishing line, you know. So, but I was on my other line. There's a lot of fishing stories in the Bible, and when you read that in the New Testament, the word fishing, it's always a reference to net fishing. Never fishing with a line. Never fishing. It's always net fishing. That's because God wants us to understand that it's about doing things together. It's about a corporate activity. It's a team sport. Net fishing is not something you do on your own. It's a team thing. So Barak did get to the battle, and there's no doubt that he had a share in the spoils of victory, because it says it quite clearly there in the song. But you don't need to be a giant killer on your own. You just don't. God is more interested in our heart and our willingness to serve him than in our personal capacity. You don't need to be a giant killer, but it's a great thing to be able to encourage one another. Think about this. Why did Jesus send his disciples out in teams of two? He always sent them out together so they could encourage one another, so they could work together. It's a great thing. Okay. Now, the last group is these... we're working up to this. We started off with those who were happy to be spectators. Then we talked about Barak, who was okay but needed some support. Now we're going to talk about these two tribes, Zebulun and Naphtali, because that's what this song, this prophetic song is really all about. And we're going to go to the next slide, which says, the very first verse of this prophetic song, chapter 5, says this: "That day after the battle, Deborah and Barak sang this song. When they let down their hair in Israel, they let it blow wild in the wind. The people volunteered with abandon." Now, this is actually quite a well-known verse, and in most translations, and I studied this in Bible college in the past, and it's about leadership. In actual fact, this is a bit of a leadership lesson today, okay? But I'm sharing it with all of us today because we're all leaders at some level. Most translations say, when leaders lead in Israel, when the people volunteered freely. And what it's just saying is that when we get a hold of, you know, our God-given mission, when we start to stand up and say, I'm gonna take my place, I'm gonna be a leader, it inspires other people. That's what the verse is saying. But I love this translation from the Message because and I looked at many translations, dozens, and they all say when leaders lead in Israel. And that's kind of a bit of translation bias because someone else had said when leaders lead. But the literal translation in the Message, it literally says in the Hebrew, the original language, it says, when they let down their hair, exactly what this is, when they let down their hair, let it blow wild in the wind. And when I read that, I just thought of, who's seen Braveheart, the movie? Okay. I was nearly going to get a little clip and put it up there, but it would be too distracting for us because it's amazing. You know, that's, Mel Gibson's speech, and he's got the amassed, the Highlanders of Scotland standing on the side of the hillside here, and they need to go and fight a battle against the British or against the English, and they're such a motley crew. They're not united. They're all over the place. Along comes Mel Gibson on his horse painted blue face, and he starts riding in front of them, and his hair is going like this. You've seen that, where his hair is flowing in the wind, and he inspires them, and he said, would you be willing to come back here just and say that they can take our lives, but they can never take our freedom? And he inspires them with this amazing speech, and the whole people, they're galvanized into action. And they fight this battle. And I want to tell you that I think that when those words were originally spoken, that's what it's talking about. Letting your hair down means I'm all in. It's talking about somebody who's 100% focused and committed to this battle, to what's got to be done. When they, by the way, is talking about Zebulun and Naphtali, those two tribes that really committed themselves, that said, I'm all in, I'm 100% in here. And they just went for it. That's what he's saying. They went for it. They let their hair down. They didn't care what anyone else thought. They were just 100% all in. I'm all in. They volunteered. When they did that, the people, the others, volunteered with abandon. Here's some very, very quickly, some lessons from this. The people of Zebulun and Naphtali, they had faith when they were called. They let their hair down. And that's what we can see in that movie from Mel Gibson. It worked. They were inspired. That's the second thing. He inspired others. They inspired others to join the battle. It started out with 10,000. By the time they got there was 40,000. And they were focused, and God did a great thing on their behalf. I want to say to you this morning, friends, that what you do and your attitude affects other people. You know, if you say, well, I'm all into something, you know, a good thing, a God thing, it affects other people. It encourages other people. So I want to encourage you today to be all in on what God is doing in your life. Whatever that is, be all in. Because our faith is contagious. We either motivate others or we demotivate them. Our faith is contagious. The last thing is that they saw, the people who were all in, they were the ones who saw the power of God at work in their life. And I really believe that because, as I said before, faith unlocks the supernatural. Faith unlocks the power of God in our life. So when we are all in, we're much more likely to see, you will see the power of God unlocked in your life. Can we have our creative team to come back right now? And we're just going to pray for a moment. I love that song that says, all my life you've been faithful. All my life you've been so, so good. With every breath that I've got, every breath that is within me, I'm going to sing of the goodness of God. You know, I think when we get a revelation of how good God is, it's a whole lot easier to be all in. Is that right? When you understand and you believe how good God is for you, it's just a lot easier to say, God, I'm all in. I'm committed to you. I'm going to take a risk. Sometimes it's a risk, you know. Maybe God's asking you to do something that you don't really have the confidence you can actually do that. Let me tell you a little secret. Tell you an inside secret as a pastor. God never asks you to do something that you're able to do, or rarely ever asks you to do something you're capable. Because if he did, you'd be doing it in your own strength. He always asks us to do things that are above us, that are a stretch, that are a reach. So we've got to trust him. That's what it's about. It's about trusting him. So if you feel that God is asking you to do something that's beyond you, hey, welcome to the kingdom of God. You're in a great place. You're in a great place there. Because you need God. He wants us to need him. That's when we start to see his power at work. When we start to see the supernatural. We start to see the word of God coming true in our life and the power of God. I'm with you. I'll never leave you. I'll never forsake you.